David Monroe, a devoted black father who adopted 10 white orphans, gives his life to raise them with love and sacrifice. But as they grow older, they reject him, their bond torn apart by resentment and prejudice. Heartbroken, David dies alone, never receiving the love he gave so freely. This story will make you cry. Before we dive into the story, please comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, please subscribe to the channel for more story every day. David Monroe stared out of the patrol car window, the city quiet on a Sunday afternoon, his thoughts drifting far from his police beat. At 38, he had built a solid career, earning respect as a compassionate and fair officer in his small Midwestern town. But as the years had passed, a hollowness had begun to settle deep within him. It wasn't the job. David loved being a cop, loved serving his community. It was something else, something more personal. He had always imagined having a family, a house filled with love and laughter, but as time went by, that dream seemed to slip further away. He sighed, rubbing his hand over his trimmed beard as his partner, Brian, finished his sandwich beside him. "You all right, man? You seem distant." David gave a half-smile. "Yeah, just thinking. Ever feel like maybe there's more to life than this?" Brian chuckled. "What, chasing down shoplifters and breaking up bar fights isn't fulfilling enough for you?" David laughed but shook his head. "Nah, I mean more. Like a family, you know?" Brian leaned back in his seat, quiet for a moment. "You've got plenty of time, Dave. You're still young." David didn't respond. It didn't feel like he had time. His relationships had always been short-lived, and now, nearing 40, the prospect of starting a family seemed like a distant dream. But something pulled at him, something he couldn't shake. Later that week, David found himself standing outside St. Mary's Orphanage, an old brick building on the outskirts of town. He had been here a few times, mostly for charity events or to drop off donations. He knew the director, Ellen, well enough to call her a friend. But today, something felt different. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of the place, disinfectant mixed with old wood, hitting him as he crossed the threshold. Ellen spotted him from behind the reception desk and smiled warmly. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, standing up to greet him. "What brings you here on a weekday?" David hesitated. He wasn't entirely sure why he had come, only that he felt drawn here. "I'm not really sure," he admitted, his voice soft. "Just wanted to see the place again." Ellen studied him for a moment, sensing there was more beneath his casual answer, but she didn't press. Instead, she led him down the familiar halls, past the playrooms and classrooms, where children's laughter echoed. "We've got a few new kids since you were last here," she said. "Some of them are having a tough time adjusting." They stopped in front of a large window that looked out over the playground. 10 children, all between the ages of 2 and 10, were scattered around. Some played on swings, while others sat quietly, talking amongst themselves. They were all white, each with their own story of abandonment or tragedy that had led them to this place. David's eyes landed on a little boy, no older than 3, sitting by himself, drawing circles in the dirt with a stick. "That's Nathan," Ellen said, following his gaze. "His parents passed away in a car accident last year. He's been struggling a lot. And over there, that's Emma and Grace, sisters, abandoned by their mother. It's hard for them, you know? People look at them and assume they'll get adopted quickly because of how they look, but it's not always the case." David's chest tightened as he watched them, something inside him stirring. They were so young, so innocent, yet they carried the weight of being unwanted. It was a feeling he knew too well, having grown up in the foster care system himself. Ellen glanced at him, noticing his expression. "David, I've seen that look before," she said gently. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" He didn't answer at first, his eyes still on the children. He had always wanted to be a father, to give a child the love and stability he never had. But 10 children. Could he really do it? "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this," he finally said, his voice low. Ellen smiled softly. "You're more ready than you think. These kids, they need someone like you, David. Someone who understands what it's like to be abandoned, to feel like you don't belong." David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come here without a plan, but standing here now, looking at those kids, he knew there was no going back. He had made his decision. "I want to adopt them," he whispered, the word surprising even him. "All of them." Ellen's eyes widened, her expression a mix of shock and admiration. "David, are you sure? That's a lot to take on." "I'm sure," he said, his voice steadier now. "They deserve a chance, a family. And I can give them that." David's small two-bedroom house on Maple Street suddenly felt like it had shrunk to half its size when the 10 children arrived. For years, it had been a peaceful, quiet place. Now it was filled with noise, toys strewn across the living room, and the constant sounds of little feet running around. David had barely had time to prepare, but the town came together, donating bunk beds, clothes, and toys. The community, while divided in some ways, couldn't deny the beauty of what David was trying to do. At first, things were chaotic. Nathan, the youngest, was still reeling from the loss of his parents, often waking up in the middle of the night crying for them. David would hold him close, soothing him with soft words and gentle rocking, even though the pain of not being able to take his sadness away weighed heavily on him. The older children, Emma, Grace, Henry, and Lily, had their own scars. They were old enough to understand what abandonment felt like, and despite David's best efforts, it was clear they didn't trust easily. "I'm not your dad," Henry, the eldest at 10, had snapped one night after dinner when David had asked him to clear the table. "You're not even like us." The word stung, but David didn't let it show. He knew this wasn't about him, it was about the hurt Henry was carrying. "I know I'm not your biological dad," he said gently. "But I'm here for you, Henry. I'll always be here." Henry had stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. That night, David lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if he was in over his head. He had given up a promotion at work to have more time with the kids, knowing the demands of raising 10 children would be all-consuming. His colleagues had been supportive, but there were whispers behind his back. Some people in town didn't think a single black man should be raising 10 white children. But David pushed those doubts aside. He wasn't doing this for anyone else. He was doing it for them. For the kids who had no one else. As the months went by, the household began to find a rhythm. Mornings were chaotic but manageable. David would wake up at 5 a.m. to make breakfast, pack lunches, and get everyone off to school. In the afternoons, they would do homework at the kitchen table while he cooked dinner. It wasn't easy. There were days when the stress of it all seemed too much. But then there were moments, like when Nathan would crawl into his lap during story time, or when Emma and Grace started calling him Dad, that made everything worth it. One evening, after the younger kids had gone to bed, David sat on the porch with Henry, who had grown more distant over the past few months. The boy had stopped fighting him at every turn, but there was still a wall between them. David handed him a soda and took a deep breath. "You know," David said quietly, "when I was your age, I didn't have a dad either. I grew up in foster care." Henry glanced at him, his usual scowl softening just a bit. "Really?" David nodded, looking out at the dark street. "Yeah, it was hard. But I had people who cared about me. That made all the difference." Henry didn't say anything, but his gaze softened. David could tell that he was starting to understand, even if he wasn't ready to fully trust him yet. Over the years, things got better. The children started to settle into their new lives, trusting David more with each passing day. The walls around their hearts, built so high from years of abandonment, began to crumble. There were still challenges, of course: teenage rebellion, school troubles, and the complexities of being a mixed-race family in a town that didn't always understand. But David was there for all of it, guiding them through the ups and downs, giving them the love and stability they needed. He had become their father in every sense of the word. And though the journey was far from easy, it was one David wouldn't trade for anything in the world. Years passed, and the Monroe household continued to grow and evolve. David's commitment to his children never wavered, even as the challenges shifted. Puberty hit, and with it came new struggles. The once small children, who had needed his constant attention and guidance, began to push back. It was a difficult adjustment for David, especially since he had no personal experience raising teenagers. But he adapted, as he always had, determined to be the father they needed him to be. Emma and Grace, now in middle school, began to question the racial dynamics of their family. They were at that age where they were trying to fit in, and being two white girls with a black father made them the subject of questions and occasional whispers at school. David tried to address their concerns openly, sitting down with them and explaining that families come in all shapes and colors. "People can be ignorant, girls," he said one evening as they sat around the kitchen table. "But love doesn't care about what we look like. You're my daughters, and that's all that matters." Emma had nodded, but David could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. Grace, the quieter of the two, stared down at her plate, biting her lip. He knew the girls were struggling, but no matter how hard he tried to make them understand, he could feel the distance growing. Henry, too, was becoming more withdrawn. Now a teenager, he had developed a rebellious streak. David had caught him sneaking out more than once, and when he confronted him about it, Henry's anger bubbled over. "You don't get it," Henry had shouted one night after David grounded him for missing curfew. "You'll never understand what it's like to be me. You're black, and you keep acting like you know what it's like for us, but you don't." David stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of Henry's words. He had tried so hard to raise them with love, to give them the home they had never known. But here was his son, accusing him of not understanding. The one thing David had always feared, that the racial divide between them would create a rift, was beginning to surface, and he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. "I may not look like you," David had said quietly, "but I love you, Henry. I've been where you are, angry, confused, feeling like the world doesn't understand you. But I do." Henry's eyes filled with tears, but he turned away before David could reach him. "No, you don't," he muttered, slamming his bedroom door behind him. David had stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, wondering where he had gone wrong. He had always known this wouldn't be easy, but he had believed that love would be enough. Now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. As the children grew older, the once warm and loving household became colder. David could feel it in the silence that filled the rooms, in the way his children avoided him more and more. They had all grown into their own people who were no longer little, no longer dependent on him in the same way. It was natural, he supposed, for kids to grow apart from their parents. But this felt different. It felt personal. Emma and Grace, now in high school, had become almost strangers to him. They rarely spoke to him unless it was necessary, and when they did, it was usually curt and dismissive. They had joined different social circles, ones where David was clearly not welcome. Their friends came over occasionally, and though they were polite, David could feel their unease around him. It hurt, though he never said anything. He didn't want to push them away further. Henry had grown even more distant. At 17, he was rarely home, spending most of his time out with friends or locked away in his room. When he did speak to David, it was only to argue. The once strong bond they had shared was now frayed, hanging on by a thread. David could feel Henry slipping away from him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop it. The other children, Luke, Sarah, Josh, and the rest, followed suit. They were polite, but it was clear they no longer saw him as the father figure they once did. They were all teenagers now, and their lives were filled with new priorities. Friends, relationships, their own identities. And with those identities came a subtle rejection of the man who had raised them. David couldn't help but wonder if it was because of his race. Had he been blind to the fact that, as they grew older, the differences between them would become too much to ignore? He had raised them to see beyond skin color, to love one another regardless of what the world said. But now, as they moved further away from him, he began to question whether he had failed them somehow. One evening, as David sat alone at the dinner table, waiting for the kids to come home from their various activities, he realized just how quiet the house had become. He had always loved the noise, the chaos of having a big family. But now, the silence was unbearable. He picked up his phone and texted the family group chat, "Dinner's ready. Come home soon." No one responded. An hour later, David ate alone. By the time the youngest of the children had graduated high school, David barely recognized the family he had once held together with so much love and dedication. The distance between him and his children had grown into a chasm, one that seemed impossible to cross. It wasn't just the typical rebelliousness of youth. It was something deeper, something more painful. They no longer spoke to him with respect. When they were home, they treated him more like an inconvenience than a father. The hurtful comments, the cold looks, They had become a part of his daily life. One evening Henry, now 20 and working part-time while living at home, came back from a night out with his friends. David, sitting in the living room with a book, looked up as Henry stumbled through the door, clearly intoxicated. "Henry," David said softly, "we need to talk." Henry groaned, rolling his eyes as he dropped onto the couch. "What now?" he muttered, his voice dripping with irritation. "I'm worried about you," David began, trying to keep his voice calm. "You've been drinking a lot, and you're not focused on your future." "I just want to help." Henry laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Help? How are you going to help me? You don't know anything about my life, Dad." David winced at the way Henry said Dad, as though it were a title he no longer deserved. "I've been where you are, son," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to feel lost." "You don't know anything," Henry shouted, standing up abruptly. "You've been pretending for years that you're this perfect dad, but you're not. You've never understood what it's like for us. You think you can raise white kids just because you wanted a family? Well, you can't. You'll never understand what we go through." David's heart ached at Henry's words, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had tried so hard, sacrificed so much, and yet here he was, being told he wasn't enough. "I've done everything I could for you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've loved you, each of you, more than anything in this world." "Yeah, well, maybe we didn't ask for that," Henry spat, his eyes filled with anger. "Maybe we didn't want to be saved by you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken resentment. David didn't know what to say. He had never expected gratitude, but he had never imagined this bitterness, this hatred. As Henry stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him, David sat back down, his hands trembling. The home he had worked so hard to build was crumbling around him, and he was powerless to stop it. In the following weeks, things only got worse. The other children, taking their cues from Henry, began to treat David with the same disdain. They criticized him for everything, for being too strict, for not understanding their struggles, for not being their real father. They blamed him for their insecurities, for their problems, for the difficulties they faced as young white adults raised by a black man. The final blow came when Emma, the once sweet girl who had called him Dad with so much love, looked him in the eye one evening and said, "Maybe you should have just adopted kids like you." David's heart broke that night. He retreated into himself, no longer trying to bridge the gap between him and his children. He still loved them, he always would, but he couldn't keep fighting a battle he had already lost. The children had made their decision. David Monroe, the man who had given them everything, was no longer their father. David spent his 60th birthday alone in the kitchen, preparing a special meal. He had been planning this for weeks, hoping that this dinner might be the beginning of something new. Perhaps time had healed some of the wounds, and maybe, just maybe, his children would come back to him. He had sent invitations to all 10 of them, reaching out despite the fact that many of them hadn't returned his calls or texts in months. It had been years since all of his children had been under the same roof, and although David knew the chances of all 10 showing up were slim, he clung to the hope that this dinner could rekindle the love they had once shared. As the evening wore on, David waited by the door, glancing at the clock as the minutes passed. By 7 p.m., only 3 had shown up: Emma, Henry, and Luke. They arrived late, and when they did, it wasn't with smiles or warmth. Emma barely looked at him as she walked in, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Henry, who had become a shadow of the boy David once knew, gave him a cursory nod before slumping into a chair. Luke offered a small smile, but it was strained, more out of obligation than genuine affection. David's heart sank, but he forced himself to smile. "I'm glad you're here," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "It's been too long since we all sat down together." Emma rolled her eyes. "Let's just get this over with," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for David to hear. Henry laughed dryly, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I'm not sure what you're expecting, Dad. This whole thing feels weird." David's smile faltered, but he pressed on, motioning for them to sit at the table. He had prepared all their favorite dishes: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, macaroni and cheese, and Emma's favorite, apple pie. He had spent hours cooking, hoping the familiar tastes of their childhood might soften their hearts, if only for a little while. As they sat down, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with unspoken resentment, and every word felt like it was weighed down by years of unresolved pain. "So," David began, trying to break the ice, "how's everyone doing? I've missed you all." Emma stabbed at her food with her fork, not looking up. Henry shrugged. Luke, who was always the more empathetic one, offered a polite response, but even his words were hollow. There was no warmth, no connection. It was as if David were dining with strangers. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, Emma finally spoke. "Why did you even invite us here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It's not like we're some happy family. This feels fake." David's heart ached at her words, but he kept his voice steady. "I wanted us to spend some time together. It's been a long time since we've all been in the same room. I thought maybe we could reconnect." "Reconnect?" Henry scoffed, dropping his fork onto his plate with a loud clatter. "You're still holding on to this fantasy, aren't you? We're not kids anymore, Dad. You can't just pretend everything's okay because you make a nice dinner." David's face fell. "I know things haven't been easy between us," he said softly, "but I love you. I've always loved you." Henry shook his head, a bitter smile on his face. "Yeah, well, love doesn't fix everything, does it? You think just because you raised us that makes everything all right? Like that erases all the other stuff? We're not even your real kids. We never were." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had feared this moment for years, but hearing it aloud, spoken with such coldness, was more painful than he had imagined. Emma joined in, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "You don't get it, do you? We're not your responsibility anymore. You did your thing, you raised us, fine. But we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for you." The room went silent, the weight of her words settling like a stone in David's chest. He looked down at his plate, his appetite long gone. The man who had given everything to them, who had sacrificed his life for their happiness, was now being told that his love was unwanted. David cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice from breaking. I'm sorry if you feel that way. I just wanted to give you a home. A family." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Well, thanks for that, I guess. But we're done here." She grabbed her coat and walked out without another word. Henry followed her, casting a final, disdainful glance at David before leaving as well. Luke hesitated, looking between his father and the door. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice. "I don't feel the same way they do, but they're right about one thing. We've all changed. I don't know how to fix this." David reached out, his voice trembling. "Luke, I don't need you to fix anything. I just want you here." Luke shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'll call you." He gave David a quick, awkward hug before following his siblings out the door. And just like that, the house was quiet again. David sat at the empty table, staring at the untouched food. The home he had built, the children he had loved with every ounce of his being, were gone. He had lost them. The weeks following that disastrous dinner were the darkest of David's life. The small glimmer of hope he had carried, the belief that his children would one day come back to him, was gone. They had made their feelings clear. He was no longer their father, if he had ever truly been one to them. David's health began to decline. He had always been strong, a pillar of strength for his family, but now he felt weak, fragile. His energy was sapped, his body no longer able to keep up with the demands of his job. He took an early retirement, the emptiness of his days mirroring the emptiness in his heart. His neighbors, kind people who had always admired his dedication as a father, noticed the change in him. They would stop by to check on him, offering food and company, but David found little solace in their kindness. His children, the ones he had sacrificed everything for, did not visit. They did not call. As the months passed, David withdrew from the world. His house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a mausoleum, a reminder of what he had lost. He would sit by the window, staring out at the street, hoping, praying, that one of them might show up. But they never did. One cold winter night, David felt a sharp pain in his chest. He clutched at his heart, the pain radiating down his arm. Panic set in, but there was no one to call. No one to help. He collapsed onto the floor, his breathing shallow and labored. As the world around him dimmed, his thoughts turned to his children. He had given them everything he had, and now, in his final moments, he was alone. David Monroe passed away that night, alone in his home. The father who had once dreamed of filling his life with the joy of children had died without a single one by his side. David's funeral was a quiet affair. The news of his passing had spread quickly through the town, and a few of his old colleagues from the police force, as well as some neighbors, came to pay their respects. But none of his children were there. Not Emma, not Henry, not Luke. The man who had raised them, loved them, had been laid to rest without them ever saying goodbye. It was only days later that the children were informed of his death. By then, it was too late. There were no tearful reunions at his bedside, no final words of love or reconciliation. The family that David had spent his life building had crumbled long before his death. Luke, the only one who had stayed somewhat in contact, was the first to visit the house after David's passing. He walked through the quiet, empty rooms, each one filled with memories of the man who had been his father. He found David's belongings neatly packed away, his police badge, the family photos that David had treasured even after the children had stopped coming home. Among the papers on David's desk was a letter, addressed to his children. With shaking hands, Luke opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Emma, Henry, Luke, and all my children. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to write it anyway. I'm not sure where things went wrong between us, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never will. Raising you all was the greatest honor of my life, even if it didn't turn out the way I'd hoped. I'm sorry if I wasn't the father you needed, and I'm sorry if I failed you in any way. But please know that everything I did out of love. You were my family, my heart, my everything. And though we've grown apart, I will always be proud of the people you've become. I hope one day you'll understand. With all my love, Ed." Tears blurred Luke's vision as he folded the letter back up, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. He had failed his father, just as they all had. David had loved them with everything he had, and in return, they had given him nothing but heartache. Luke stood in the empty house, the weight of his father's sacrifice finally sinking in. It was too late to make amends, too late to say the words that had been left unsaid. But as he stood there, he made a vow, to honor his father's memory, to ensure that David Monroe's love would not be forgotten. It was a small, quiet memorial. The children gathered for the first time since that fateful dinner, each of them grappling with their own feelings of regret. They stood by David's grave, silent as the wind whispered through the trees. And though the damage had been done, though they had lost the man who had given them everything, there was a glimmer of understanding in their hearts, a realization, far too late, that David had been the only true father they had ever known. Years passed after David's death, and life moved on for his children, though none of them could escape the shadow of their guilt. Each of them dealt with their regrets in different ways. Some tried to forget, burying themselves in work or their own families, while others found themselves haunted by the memories of the father they had lost. Luke, the one who had held David's final letter, took it upon himself to keep his father's memory alive. He had spent weeks after the funeral cleaning out the house, sorting through the remnants of David's life. Every photo, every note, every item he found was a reminder of how much David had loved them. Despite the painful memories, Luke couldn't bring himself to sell the house. Instead, he turned it into a space of reflection, a memorial of sorts, where the family could come, if they ever felt the need, to remember the man who had given them everything. Emma was the first to visit after the funeral, though it took her years to gather the courage. She had moved to a different state, far away from the town she grew up in, hoping that distance would help her escape the pain of her childhood and the shame of how she had treated her father. But it never worked. The weight of her betrayal followed her everywhere, seeping into her relationships, her work, her own sense of self. She couldn't look at her reflection without seeing the girl who had turned her back on the only man who had ever cared for her. One day, she found herself standing on the porch of David's old house, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. Luke had told her she was always welcome, and for the first time in years, she was ready to face what she had left behind. The house was quiet, just as it had been the night David passed. But this time, the silence wasn't so unbearable. Emma walked slowly through the rooms, her fingers brushing over the furniture, the framed pictures on the walls. There were photos of her and Grace as children, beaming at the camera, with David standing behind them, his hand resting gently on their shoulders. There were pictures of Henry at his high school graduation, Luke blowing out candles on his 5th birthday, all moments that David had cherished, even when his children no longer did. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she realized how much her father had held on to, even after they had let go. He had never stopped believing in them, even when they had turned their backs on him. She found herself in David's old study, the room where he had written the letter they had all read too late. She sat at his desk, her head in her hands, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to mourn, not just for her father, but for the relationship she had destroyed. Emma stayed in the house for hours, and when she left, she felt lighter, as though a piece of her had finally found peace. Henry, too, couldn't escape the guilt. He had spent most of his 20s drifting from job to job, relationship to relationship, always feeling like something was missing. His anger, which had once been directed at David, had no outlet now, and over time, he realized that the person he was truly angry with was himself. He had spent so many years blaming David for things that were never his fault, using their differences as an excuse to push him away. But now that David was gone, Henry saw the truth clearly. His father had only ever loved him, and it was Henry's own fear and insecurity that had driven them apart. One night, after months of wrestling with his emotions, Henry decided to visit the house. He hadn't been back since the funeral, but he knew he needed to go. When he arrived, he found Luke sitting on the porch, as though waiting for him. They sat together in silence for a long time, neither of them needing to speak. The house stood behind them, a silent witness to the years they had lost, and the brothers shared a moment of understanding, an acknowledgement of the father they had failed, but also of the love that still lingered, even in his absence. Henry spent the night in his old bedroom, lying awake as memories of his childhood flooded back. He remembered the nights David had stayed up late helping him with his homework, the afternoons they had spent tossing a football in the yard. He remembered the look in David's eyes during that final dinner, the pain Henry had inflicted with his cruel words. And as the dawn broke, Henry made a promise to himself: he would do better. He would live a life that honored his father's memory, a life of kindness, patience, and love, the same things David had tried to teach him all those years. As the years went by, the siblings reconnected, slowly repairing the bond that had been shattered along with their relationship with David. It wasn't easy, and it took time, but they knew that it was what their father would have wanted. Though they could never undo the hurt they had caused him, they could honor his legacy by living with the love and forgiveness he had shown them. They gathered at the house every year on David's birthday, a quiet tradition that grew out of their shared grief. It was never a large event, just the siblings, sitting around the table that had once been filled with tension and anger, now sharing stories of the father who had raised them. They laughed about the small things, David's corny jokes, his inability to cook anything without burning it first, but there were moments of sadness, too, as they remembered the man they had lost too soon. One year, Grace stood up and proposed a small ceremony in David's honor. She suggested planting a tree in the backyard, a symbol of the life David had built for them and the roots he had given them. The others agreed, and together, they planted a sturdy oak tree in the middle of the yard, its branches stretching toward the sky, just as David's love had stretched across their lives. As they stood around the newly planted tree, the siblings held hands, a silent tribute to the man who had taught them the meaning of family, even when they had refused to see it. There was no grand gesture, no tearful apology that could undo the past, but there was peace in knowing that, in the end, they had come together to honor the father who had given them everything. David Monroe may not have lived to see the love he had planted grow, but in the quiet moments beneath the oak tree, his children finally understood the depth of his sacrifice. They carried his memory with them, not as a burden, but as a source of strength, a reminder that love, even in its most painful and imperfect forms, was worth fighting for. The house remained in the family, a symbol of David's lasting legacy. And though the years continued to pass, the oak tree grew taller, its roots deepening in the soil of the home where love, however imperfect, had always lived.